What would you do if someone in power tried to silence you, without ever speaking to you first? On a quiet suburban street where every lawn was perfectly trimmed and every mailbox looked identical, the Khan family was doing something simple. They were hosting a small evening gathering in their backyard. Soft lights were strung across the fence. The scent of homemade food drifted gently into the air, and a few close friends sat around a long table sharing stories and laughter. It wasn't loud. It wasn't chaotic. It was peaceful. But from behind the blinds of the house across the street, HOA President Richard Halstead watched with growing irritation. In his mind, this wasn't a harmless get-together. This was a pattern. He had noticed cars parked along the curb before. He had seen guests entering the home on previous weekends. Instead of walking across the street and introducing himself like a reasonable neighbor, he began documenting everything from a distance, taking photos, writing notes, building a narrative in his head that something about this family didn't fit the community image he believed he was responsible for protecting. That night, as more guests arrived carrying covered dishes and greeting each other warmly, Richard made a decision. Without warning, without conversation, he called the police and reported a potential violation involving unauthorized community events and suspicious recurring gatherings. His tone was calm, but his words carried weight. 20 minutes later, flashing patrol lights illuminated the calm street, turning a peaceful evening into a scene of confusion. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Children ran toward their parents. Mr. Khan stepped forward as two officers approached the gate, their presence formal but cautious. "We received a complaint about this gathering," one officer said. The word complaint echoed louder than the siren had. Around them, neighbors began stepping onto porches, drawn by curiosity. Mr. Khan explained gently that it was a private dinner with friends, nothing more. The officers observed carefully. No excessive noise, no blocked driveways, no visible rule violations. Just plates of food, respectful guests, and an atmosphere that felt more welcoming than disruptive. As the officers continued asking routine questions, Richard stepped outside, arms crossed, ready to justify his call. He spoke about maintaining standards and protecting property values, but when asked to specify which exact HOA rule had been broken, his answers became vague. The energy shifted. The authority he expected to reinforce his position instead began questioning it. Neighbors exchanged glances. Some looked uncomfortable. Others looked quietly disappointed. The officers, maintaining professionalism, clarified that hosting a small, private gathering did not constitute a violation under the guidelines provided. They reminded Richard that emergency services are not tools for enforcing personal discomfort. The moment stretched in silence, a silence heavier than any accusation. The flashing lights reflected off the windows, capturing every expression. What was meant to assert control had instead exposed assumption. And as the patrol cars eventually pulled away, leaving the street dim and still once more, it wasn't just the gathering that everyone would remember. It was the realization that sometimes the greatest disturbance isn't noise. It's prejudice disguised as authority. But what Richard didn't realize was that this wasn't the first time someone had felt targeted. The patrol cars had barely disappeared around the corner when the quiet tension on the street turned into low whispers between neighbors. What had started as curiosity was now something else, reflection. A few residents lingered outside longer than usual, replaying what they had just witnessed. Inside his home, Richard Halstead stood near his window, convinced he had simply done his duty as HOA president. In his mind, leadership meant vigilance. It meant control. It meant preventing anything that looked out of the ordinary. But across the street, the Khan family's evening had changed completely. The laughter had softened. The children stayed closer to their parents. Guests who once felt relaxed now felt observed. And while the officers had found no violation, the emotional impact lingered. What Richard failed to see was that this moment wasn't about rules, but it was about trust. Over the past year, subtle patterns had gone unnoticed by most, but not by everyone. a warning letter about lawn decor that matched their cultural celebrations, a reminder email about consistent neighborhood aesthetics sent the morning after a family gathering, a polite but pointed comment during an HOA meeting about maintaining traditional standards. Each incident alone seemed small, harmless even, but together they painted a quiet picture. And now, with police involvement, that picture was impossible to ignore. Later that night, as guests began heading home, something unexpected happened. One neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, walked across the street and knocked on the Khan family's door. She didn't come with questions. She came with reassurance. She admitted she had once received similar treatment when her extended family visited from out of town. Another neighbor followed, then another. What Richard had framed as enforcement was beginning to look like isolation. And the more the story spread, through private conversations and neighborhood group chats, the clearer it became that this wasn't about one dinner. It was about a leadership style rooted in suspicion instead of communication. Meanwhile, inside his home, Richard drafted an email to the community, emphasizing the importance of upholding guidelines. He expected agreement, support, validation, but when responses began arriving, the next morning, they weren't what he anticipated. Residents politely questioned the necessity of police involvement. Some asked for clarification on which exact rule had been broken. Others expressed discomfort with how quickly authority had escalated the situation. For the first time since becoming HOA president, Richard felt something unfamiliar, doubt. Not about the rules, but about perception, because leadership in a neighborhood isn't just about enforcing policies. It's about fostering belonging. And as the sun rose over perfectly trimmed lawns and identical rooftops, one thing was certain: the night before hadn't strengthened control. It had quietly shifted power, not through confrontation, not through anger, but through awareness. The next HOA meeting was supposed to be routine, but it became something no one saw coming. 3 nights after the police incident, the community clubhouse filled faster than usual. Normally, HOA meetings were predictable: budget updates, landscaping discussions, minor complaints about trash bins or parking alignment. But this time the air felt different. People weren't there for shrubs or sidewalk cracks. They were there because something had shifted in the neighborhood's sense of fairness. Richard Halstead sat at the front table with his usual composed posture, a printed agenda neatly aligned in front of him. He expected murmurs to fade once the meeting began. He expected order. What he didn't expect was silence, not the polite silence of routine meetings, but a heavy, waiting silence. When he opened the floor for comments, Mr. Khan calmly stood up. There was no anger in his voice. No raised tone, just clarity. He described the dinner. He described the confusion when police arrived. He described how his children had asked why officers were at their home. The room remained still. Then Mrs. Alvarez spoke. She shared her experience. Another neighbor followed, recalling a warning letter about hosting a birthday party. One by one, residents began connecting small moments that, until now, had felt isolated. Patterns became visible. Richard attempted to redirect the conversation toward community standards, but the tone of the room had already changed. This wasn't rebellion, it was accountability. A retired attorney living on the corner quietly asked Richard to cite the specific clause in the HOA guidelines that justified contacting law enforcement for a private gathering without prior written notice or direct communication. Papers shuffled. Richard referenced general authority clauses, but the answer lacked precision. For the first time since he took office, his authority wasn't being accepted at face value. It was being examined carefully, publicly. The discussion stretched longer than planned. Some residents expressed concern about liability for unnecessary police calls. Others emphasized that community leadership should begin with dialogue, not escalation. The board members seated beside Richard shifted uncomfortably, sensing the direction of momentum. And then something unexpected happened. A motion was proposed, not to remove him immediately, not to accuse him formally, but to review enforcement procedures and establish a requirement that non-emergency concerns must first involve direct communication with homeowners before external authorities are contacted. The motion was seconded almost instantly. Hands began to raise across the room, not aggressively, not dramatically, just steadily. Richard looked around and saw what he hadn't anticipated: unity, not against him personally, but against the approach he represented. When the motion passed by clear majority, applause didn't erupt. Instead, there was something more powerful: collective calm. The kind of calm that follows fairness being restored. As residents slowly stood to leave, conversations were thoughtful, not heated. Mr. Khan shook hands with neighbors. Children ran around the clubhouse, unaware of the governance shift that had just occurred, and Richard remained seated for a moment longer than usual, staring at the printed agenda that no longer seemed relevant. For the first time, the title HOA President felt heavier than it did powerful. Because leadership, he was beginning to understand, isn't measured by control, it's measured by trust. And trust, once questioned publicly, changes everything. What happened the following week didn't just challenge Richard's authority, it tested his character. In the days after the meeting, the neighborhood felt unusually observant. Lawns were still trimmed, mailboxes still identical, but conversations carried new awareness. The revised enforcement motion had officially passed, meaning every future complaint required documented, neighbor-to-neighbor communication before escalation. On paper, it was a procedural adjustment. In reality, it was a quiet vote of no confidence in how things had been handled. Richard told himself it was simply administrative evolution, nothing personal. Yet every time he stepped outside, he sensed something had changed. Eye contact lingered a little longer. Greetings felt more measured. Meanwhile, the Khan family chose not to retreat inward. Instead, they did something unexpected. They posted a simple message in the neighborhood group chat thanking those who had shown support and inviting anyone interested to an open community dessert evening the following Friday. No occasion, no agenda, just neighbors meeting neighbors. The invitation was polite and pressure-free, but symbolically it was powerful. When Friday arrived, string lights once again illuminated their backyard, not brighter than before, not louder, just welcoming. And one by one, residents showed up. Some brought cookies, others brought chairs. Conversations flowed naturally, not about conflict but about work, schools, hobbies, and shared experiences of moving into the community years earlier. Children from different households played together as if nothing significant had happened. The atmosphere wasn't defiant, it was inclusive. And across the street, standing near his window again, Richard watched. But this time the scene looked different. It didn't look suspicious. It looked connected. He noticed something he hadn't paid attention to before. How many neighbors were genuinely smiling. How easily conversations crossed cultural lines. How normal it all was. Later that evening, something unexpected happened. A small group of residents walked across the street, not toward the Khan home, but toward Richard's. They knocked politely. When he opened the door, they didn't accuse him. They didn't confront him. Instead, they invited him. "You should come by," Mrs. Alvarez said gently. "It's just dessert." For a moment, pride and hesitation battled internally. Accepting meant acknowledging misjudgment. Declining meant reinforcing distance. The silence stretched. Finally, after a pause longer than necessary, Richard stepped outside and followed them across the street. Conversations quieted briefly when he entered the backyard, but not with hostility, with curiosity. Mr. Khan approached first, not with sarcasm, not with resentment, but with an extended hand. "Glad you could make it," he said simply. No speech, no public reckoning, just civility. And in that small, understated moment, the tension that had built over weeks began dissolving. Because while policies can correct actions, only humility can repair relationships. As Richard stood there holding a paper plate with a slice of homemade cake, he realized something far more powerful than any HOA rulebook. Communities aren't preserved through suspicion. They're strengthened through understanding. And sometimes the hardest step for a leader isn't enforcing standards. It's admitting when they misunderstood them. But the real consequence of that night wasn't written in any HOA rulebook. It was written in reputation. In the weeks that followed, life on Maple Grove Lane slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Morning joggers passing by, delivery trucks stopping briefly, sprinklers ticking across green lawns at sunset. On the surface, everything looked the same. But underneath that calm exterior, something fundamental had shifted. Richard was still HOA president. No dramatic resignation, no public removal. Yet authority felt different now. It wasn't automatic anymore. It had to be earned. Every email he drafted was reread twice. Every decision was weighed more carefully. Because once a community witnesses power misused, even subtly, it doesn't forget. Meanwhile, the Khan family's home had become something unexpected, a quiet symbol. Not of rebellion, not of division, but of resilience handled with dignity. Neighbors, who had once only exchanged polite waves, now stopped to have real conversations. Invitations flowed more freely between houses. Cultural holidays were no longer observed quietly behind fences. They were shared openly, explained, celebrated. What began as suspicion had unintentionally sparked connection. And perhaps the most surprising transformation happened within Richard himself. Late one evening, sitting alone at his dining table with the HOA guidelines spread before him, he began noticing something he had overlooked for years. The rules were written to maintain property standards, not to measure belonging. Somewhere along the way, he had blurred that line. He had equated difference with disruption. But the memory of flashing police lights reflecting off innocent faces stayed with him. The image of children asking why officers were at their home lingered heavier than any policy violation ever could. Reputation, he realized, isn't damaged in loud explosions. It shifts quietly, in moments when fairness is questioned. And rebuilding it doesn't happen through authority. It happens through accountability. So at the next monthly meeting, before budgets or landscaping updates were discussed, Richard did something no one expected. He addressed the room plainly. No defensiveness, no lengthy justification. He acknowledged that calling the police, without first speaking directly to the homeowners, had been a mistake. He stated that leadership requires listening before assuming. The room was silent, not tense this time, but attentive. And in that moment, something rare happened. Respect began to return. Not because he held power, but because he showed humility. The story of that night would always remain part of the neighborhood's history, but it no longer stood as a symbol of division. Instead, it became a reminder that communities are fragile when ruled by fear, but strong when guided by understanding. And on Maple Grove Lane, the lesson was clear. Sometimes the loudest disturbance isn't a gathering in a backyard. It's the echo of a rushed judgment. And sometimes the most powerful transformation doesn't happen when someone wins. It happens when someone learns.